Hi, I'm Clay Ogg with EPA's Policy Office. I just read a IFPRI study that was forecast. This was just came out. Was forecasting that there would be huge increases in the price of crops because of biofuels in the last 2 or 3 years. So these policies, these new biofuel support policies, are totally changing everything upside down. Those increases have actually occurred, so it seems to me that WTO, what they've been struggling with, and what was presented here is sort of the opposite of what's happened in the last 3 years, where developed country policies are actually supporting the prices for countries, agriculture all over the world, and the consumers are the ones that people are worried about now. So is this going to change everything?
Eric Young, USDA. Dr. Anderson, I took that you were implying that the increase in India and China, India being basically through the overhangs that they could raise their rate of protection or subsidy essentially. But on China, that doesn't, with their low applied and low bound, that doesn't seem to be as much of a concern. One wouldn't think so. Of course, you did mention the SSM and the special products. But how does the blue box figure into that, with that now being potentially available to them?
Tom Gray, USDA. I'm not an economist. I'm a sociologist. Do you address really issues of cultural displacement? You talk a little bit about poverty and inequality, but being an outsider here and noticing protest all over the globe, that seems to me to be issues about cultural displacement. And I'm wondering if those kinds of needs are really being addressed in the third world with this line of research.
The question of whether high prices that we have this year are likely to continue. It's true, IFPRI's and OECD FAO projections also do suggest through the next few decades that there will be prices will be higher for farm products relative to non-farm vis-a-vis 2000, which is, if you look at that 50 years projection, that's the opposite of what happened in the 20th century, for example, when those prices fell about 0.8% per year over the century. If you look at Jeff Williamson's earlier or recent work, though, on earlier decades, you'll see that he has, for the 17th and 18th century, rising prices for primary products as well. So we've had long periods where it's gone in both directions. The question is whether these forecasts are robust for this present half century, and already we've seen a significant drop just with this potential recession coming on. So I think it's early days really to think through there. It does depend heavily, I think, on the subsidies that both the Europeans and the Americans are willing to give to biofuels, but even there, the Americans are talking with the Brazilians about potentially lowering the tariff on biofuel imports, so that may reduce the extent of distortion here that biofuels are causing. If there's a relocation of production to Brazilian sugar instead of US corn, that'll be less distorting than if we stayed with US corn for that. But one hopes, as in Europe, that there might be a rethink about this whole biofuel subsidy business and mandates and return to something more normal there. And the price decline in petroleum, what was it, $140 a few weeks ago, is now 80 or even a bit less recently. So that decline is also going to reduce the profitability of biofuels. So I'm not sure. I think the long-term future, if agricultural productivity growth were allowed to continue, would continue to push those prices down, and acceptance of genetic modification seems to be happening slowly, and so that might be the new source of another green revolution that will push those prices down. So for this current year or so, certainly, as we saw already in 05-07 in those graphs, there's been this drop in nominal rates of assistance in rich countries, and it'll drop even more in 08 when the numbers come out. But if prices return to something closer to normal, then if there's no change in government policies, we'll expect those NRAs to rise again. Greg's question about China, my point was that this assumption that there's not much binding overhang in China, I just don't think is right by looking at the at the data, and I had another talk with Will Martin about that today, and he's followed this very closely. It does seem like there is scope. They're not even at their filling in their quotas at the moment at the very low tariffs, but if they were to become much more importers of food into the future, and they got to those to the quota, then the question is, would they raise the tariffs to the outer quota levels, which are 60%, 40%, those very high rates, and that would allow scope for that. Plus domestic subsidies, if they've got plenty of money in the kitty there, they can go up to 17.5% with domestic subsidies. And that's a huge amount of assistance compared with nothing now. An average of 1 or 2% now, you had raised to 17%, have a big impact. So I'm not sure that those bindings are as tight as we thought they might have been. Point about culture, Professor Hayami, who's one of our senior advisors on this group, has written a paper for us, which is on the website, which is concerned with the issue of, in Asia, if we do get rapid industrialisation continuing there, will we get, he's not worried about poverty. Poverty will continue to get alleviated by that growth, but he is worried about relative inequality, the inequality between farm and non-farm incomes, and he thinks that may well be a source of agricultural protection growth in the most rapidly growing, at least of the Asian countries, and that society won't tolerate that, as they didn't in Korea, and that they will choose to protect farmers somewhat from those forces that structural change that is associated with economic growth would otherwise deliver. So, there might be that sort of concern. I was talking on the weekend, though, with people in France, French people in France, who were saying how much nonsense this is about preserving the culture of people on the farms. And as many Parisians who have country houses know, when you go to these villages, there's nobody in these villages except these Parisians who go down there in the weekends, because the agricultural areas have just hollowed out, as they have here in the US, and people are just going away in droves, and suitcase farming takes over. So I'm not sure how much cultural drive there is to preserve in that sort of way. So I'm not saying it could be ignored, and I don't think governments are ignoring it. That's why there is this fear of agricultural protection and growth. But I'm just asking about the reality of it on the ground as compared with what it's very real for urban people who think about those things, but whether it's real.
Do you take the global warming discussion seriously? And if you did, how would you incorporate that in your modelling?
I'm Elizabeth Ward from the Australian Embassy. I'd just like to ask for Dr. Anderson to clarify the comments he made on the slide on bindings matter. It just strikes me that when Japan and Korea acceded to the GATT, this was pre-agreement on agriculture, and so the bindings that you've included there on the slide don't include agriculture bindings relative to your China dot, which presumably does include a binding on agriculture, and therefore the nominal rates of assistance would be measuring different things.
Jock Anderson, University of New England. Kim, I was reading your areas for further research, and it reads like a comfort story that you're very happy with your methodology, basically. And since you seem to have systematically excluded explicit consideration of uncertainty in the many parameters, I was wondering whether you implicitly also think that that's quite unimportant and not worthy of further analysis.
Suzanne Hale from USDA. What about changes in technology? It seems like with things like the Green Revolution really increased rice yields. Some countries have adopted new technologies faster than other countries. And did you look at that at all in your model? And if you didn't, would it be worth looking at?
I think one of the most remarkable findings you presented was that developing countries have indeed reduced this bias against agriculture in the past 20 years. And from the findings of your phase 2, where various scholars have looked into the political economy of that, could you perhaps comment a bit of what were the major reasons for that? What role did structural adjustment play? What role did democratization, which may have reduced the political voice of farmers, play? So maybe you could comment a bit on the political economy of that massive change.
Global warming, I think we've got huge uncertainty about what that might impact, how that might impact world markets, but there's a lot of work going on throughout the world looking at that at the moment. It will be the topic of next year's World Development Report at the World Bank, so they're doing a whole lot of modelling, but a zillion other people are as well. My little touch on that is I'm looking at what it might do to the wine industries, which will be much more interesting for Jock than worrying about what it does to food. That's something that we just have to think about, and I don't know how that's going to affect world markets any more than anybody else does. So too much going on there. What will happen to water policy in a response to climate change, for example? I mean, that would make a big difference in Australia. That's the main focus of domestic attention at the same time as we're thinking about a climate change response policy. So adaptation is going to be the name of the game. How much R&D will be done to help agriculture adapt to this if there isn't much mitigation? There's just so many uncertainties there. But anyway, good area to do research because nobody's going to say you're wrong. They're just going to see it's an input into the process. Elizabeth's question about the nominal rates in China versus Japan, Korea. All I was doing on that map was showing what our estimate of the nominal rate of assistance was. In fact, it should really be the nominal rate to import competing agriculture. In Japan and Korea, that's the same thing. In China, it's not because there's an export sector in there. But the point is that at the time of accession, there were roughly similar rates, less than 20% rates of assistance to each of those three countries. In China and in Korea and Japan now we have rates of a couple of 100%. If those had been bound, then we wouldn't have seen that rise, presumably. That wasn't the case. The question now is, does it matter for countries like China? And my point is that I think there is still a lot of room for China to increase its assistance to agriculture that is not bound in the GATT. We've got nice low rates in quota, but and the quotas are pretty large. But as we saw with iron ore and coal, if this economy didn't keep increasing its relative prices to farmers through protectionism it would now involve for agriculture, then there is this prospect that they will become larger and larger net importers, at least of feed grains, and that will have an impact on international prices. How large we'll see, but not. I don't expect it to be as large as it was for iron ore and coal. There's a different income elasticity of demand associated with food, but it could well be non-trivial. Jock's point about uncertainty, that's it's not only that, it's the whole area of instability and volatility in international markets, which we've hardly touched on with this database, but I think there's huge scope for doing it, and there's now a mandate and interest in it because of the current spike this year. So already we're talking with people who are interested in applying this database to analyse the past and then use lessons from that to understand what we might do in the present and future. And I think that's a very exciting area to do some work in. We only have annual data, unfortunately, and a lot of the richness might come by looking at intra-year responses by markets and governments to price movements. But plenty of work to be done there. It'd be good fun, I think, to work on that. Technology changes, certainly they're built into this whole measurement of distortions because we're just looking at the actual prices that are operating domestically and internationally. So technical change certainly has an impact on those. But when you start doing some CGE modelling, you would want to try and build that in as well. And we didn't in that little retrospective exercise and prospective exercise, we didn't do anything other than just change prices and ask what impacts would that have. But clearly you could do that. Peter Dixon and his crowd at Monash University have done a very nice job in doing a backcasting where they take account of taste change, technology change and policy change in looking at a particular set of issues. And if you did that carefully, you could come up with a better answer about the relative importance of those three different components. We didn't do that. We just quickly had a look at the price changes. Political economy, that's everything I write with a little section like Jock quoted at the end there about what to do next. People say, oh, why don't you write the paper about the political economy? Well, Anne wrote a whole book on that, but that was 20 years ago, and we've now got this opportunity to do it again with more recent data. We've had, as I said, some attempt at doing this. 15 or so papers will come into a book next year that do a first brush at looking at some of that. But to be honest, I haven't even read the revised versions of the paper. They're sitting there waiting for me when I get home. And now that I've got this global book out of the way from stage 1, then we'll start moving on to stage 2. But everybody wants to know the answers to that. And as if you can get them without having done all this hard work at the beginning to generate these time series in the first place. So